part was, I think the title is "So What" or something like that, which I love that. I'm not going to lie. I went with Revelation and Apologetics. What I'd like to do for a few minutes, and I am aware that I am the thing standing between all of you and lunch, and I'm mindful of that. What I'd like to do for a few minutes is sort of take all the stuff that I've been kind of taking notes along and kind of incorporating a little bit of it. I'm really pleased to be following Young because I'm able to dovetail off a lot of it. I swear I wrote mine first. There's no place for it. But what I'd like to do is take a few minutes and contemplate how do we take this information and take our understanding of Revelation, our understanding of all that goes with it, and how do we address the culture? How do we do apologetics in the light of this information? How do we do apologetics surrounding the book of Revelation? You're right. No, this is on a weird. I don't think I can actually. I don't know if I can really pop out of that. This is a different software. I'm not going to let you do that. Okay. Believe me, I tried because I'm too cheap to buy. Oh, well, that's a thing. There you go. Okay. I'm too cheap to buy Microsoft Office, so I'm using this like free source analogous software, which works-ish. So with what I was saying, I'm not really planning on doing a lot of theology this morning. You guys have all done far beyond anything I could ever contemplate doing. But also, at the fall clerk, I spoke briefly on engaging people with special needs in the church. My background is in church history, sociology, religion, educational psychology. I spend a lot of time thinking about how people think. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to communicate across barriers. That's sort of kind of what I do for a living. It's also what I spend a lot of my free time doing. It's also that informs a lot of how I think about ministry, how I think about what I hope to do in ministry, what I have done in ministry, and so that's kind of that frame. And so from that, what I'd like to kind of toss out at you is one of many possible frames or possible schemas for how we engage people. With that in mind, a couple of caveats and so forth. I'm going to be using the phrase popular eschatology. And that is basically a euphemism for the way in which Revelation and prophecy, the apocalypse, the end of the world, all of those themes are tied together in the larger culture. And there's two reasons I want to use that phrase. The first one is I think it's broadly descriptive. The second reason I want to use that phrase is I want to, for the purpose of this discussion, draw a distinction between serious people with serious ideas who have serious disagreements about serious things, okay, over here, and what's happening in the culture over here. So, and I do that partly because I think it's important, but also partly as an act of charity, because I don't want to get bogged down into some of the differences in how we see Revelation. I want us to take one step back, kind of take that bird's eye view, and look at Revelation phenomenologically in the culture, just for a little bit, and do that in a way that allows us to engage people when they engage us. Funny story, the very first time I ever put on one of these, I was leaving the hotel to go to my ordination in the HCNA. And I come out of the hotel room, I go towards the elevator, and the janitor at the hotel stops me and asks me to pray with him. Very first one. I was a little bit, didn't know what to do. I think we've all had that experience. As clergy, as Christians, we are going to be engaged with people, or engaged by people who come to us with their concerns, their worries, their fears, their anxieties. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that a lot of that anxiety, fear, concern, worry about the future is shot through a lens of revelation in ways that are not necessarily edifying. And so there's basically three ideas I'd like to hit here. Our culture is saturated in revelation. Most of what it thinks about revelation is wrong. And the antidote to the chaos is word and sacrament. I say this a little bit facetiously, but I think I can get away with it here. Does anyone not think that that our culture is saturated in the book of Revelation? Has anyone tried to purchase handgun ammunition recently? We live in a worried culture. Would everyone agree with that? Yeah. We live in a culture that is deeply concerned about its macro future, deeply concerned about our individual futures, deeply concerned about their families' futures, their economic futures, deeply worried about division and strife. And for reasons we'll get into, let me go ahead and move to the next slide here. For reasons we can get into, I think, I'm going to say that again, I think there is evidence that a lot of that worry and anxiety and fear in American culture is shot through the prism of revelation. And once we understand that, we can both address the apologetics directly, which I think is important, but we can also address the crisis of the heart that underlies that in people. First, these are ballpark statistics. I've pulled some different strings of data, but here's a general back-of-the-envelope ballpark consensus. Roughly 80% of Americans claim to be some kind of religious, something resembling Christian-ish. Of that group, approximately 40% believe they're living in the end times. So that's a ballpark, back-of-the-envelope figure that roughly a third-ish of Americans not only believe in some sense, that's very malleable, let's stress it, very malleable, but in some sense believe that the book of Revelation represents an accurate depiction of reality and that they're living in it now. And that's really a big deal. Unfortunately, most of what they're getting from that does not come from the kind of scripturally grounded places that we would hope for. That doesn't come from things like this seminar. It comes from the culture, it comes from media. I was looking up, according to the Internet Movie Database, there are over 300 Hollywood feature films where the book of Revelation is the central plot device. How many of these do you think are theologically sound? Anybody? The Babylon Bee did a wonderful thing. Y'all familiar with the Bee? It's like this, yeah, okay. I love the Bee. They did this wonderful thing where they reported that, there wrote a fake article, they said that a group of top theologians have established that AC/DC albums are more theologically correct than Joel Osteen. And I felt like, so one of the things we're dealing with here is that, in fact, I was looking at my eBay, when I got back to my hotel last night, I had to thread through eBay. I'm in a constant state of spelling things, and my wife calls it peddling. So I flip more popular culture that I'm actually willing to consume. But one thing I've noticed is that, and I actually looked at some scholarly papers on this, the amount of imagery, the amount of thematic elements that are drawn from Revelation that are in the popular culture, things like The Walking Dead, full of allusions to Revelation. You see that a lot, actually, in a lot of like the superhero movies that have been popular the last few years. The images, the themes of Revelation are being pulled into the culture because it is such a visually and linguistically alive text that it's easy to, it's a easy to use source. Hunter S. Thompson, the guy here living in Las Vegas, once famously said that, he was also famous for having writer's block, which is relevant to this. He said that whenever he had writer's block and he had a deadline, he would open the book of Revelation. This was a profoundly not religious person, wildly so. But he said that he would use it as a writing springboard. He would just start flipping through the book of Revelation until he came across a phrase or an image or something he could kind of, I can work that. And that's actually more common than you might think. And so a lot of the people that we encounter are getting their source on, getting their information about Revelation, about what Revelation is trying to tell them, from sources that are not just bad theology, but are fundamentally not concerned with biblical truth. And once you kind of catch on to that, it's, oh, well, obviously, so you just watched them for a few minutes. But I would like to suggest there are a couple of root sources of how that entered the culture. First one is going to be Millerism, William Miller. I'm just picking this note. The bishop mentioned my backstory because it's such an obvious place. You know, we talk about the Seventh-day Adventist movement. We have to remember there were a series of Advent movements, plural, in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Some of them are still around today, where there was this cultural shift of which the Seventh-day Adventists were probably the most well known, where between the forces of the Industrial Revolution, social upheaval, all of the events leading up to the Civil War and so forth, there became this interest in the future. There was this anxiety in the culture moving from being very rural and very agrarian, a little more urban. So one of the ways in which that anxiety was engaged was in looking to see, well, what does the Bible say is going to happen? What can we latch on to? We can take some comfort in. We can know what's going to happen so we're not surprised. Anyone ever take a car trip with a little kid? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? What's next? Are we there yet? Are we any different? Psychologically, we use fancy words, but we're the same. We want to know what's going on. We have this deep need to know where we stand in a narrative. I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. But that then happened as part of this larger movement called actually the Second Great Awakening in this case, which was this movement in American religious life. And one of the things that happened in that movement, there were a lot of, I actually find that period really, really interesting. One of the things that happened was what we call Congregationalism. It already happened for a long time, but it became sort of the cultural norm in American life. Your local church kind of has its own little thing going, and that's valid in that schema, in that worldview. One of the things that was also happening at the same time was, and this is just like a really weird flex, but think about how these simple little things can change everything. Pulp paper, cheap printing presses, wide distribution of anyone's ideas, sort of like the internet before the internet, was another thing that happened at the same time. I deal in a lot of vintage paper. One of the coolest things I ever flipped was a pair of, from the early 1850s, this pair of broadsides. They're about this big. They're like two large pieces of paper folded over. And they were religious newspapers from the Oneida community in upstate New York in the early 1850s. They was people who wanted to develop an Oneida silverware. And so I picked them up and flipped them. But while I had them for a while, I went through them very carefully, and they are insane. I don't know how else to describe that. It is the most bizarre religious ravings you could possibly imagine, interspersed with very useful articles on, gardening and, making Apparently they had a trade in wicker baskets, as I recall. But here's the thing that's happening in American politics. You could publish whatever you wanted to publish on, really, with no barrier, no restriction. Anybody could do it, and there was a better than good chance that people would pick it up and read it. There was this incredible democratization in religious life at the same time that there was this sudden cultural shift in emphasis on prophecy and revelation. What do you think is going to happen out of that? The DIY ethic in American religion. I was telling Bishop, my wife and I, we do rentals, and we're working on a house in Lawrence, South Carolina. And so I'm kind of scoping out the religious landscape there. There's this main street. There's like 2 blocks of Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Episcopal. Where the church has always been there. And I figure they have about 9 people each in each of these. But then surrounding that are an untold number of these little tiny, usually like right between like the nail salon and like the check cashing place, these little tiny churches, and they all have names like Shekinah Glory, Holiness Tabernacle of the Word and Inspiration, with the Most High Holy Apostle Bob. And I love them. They're off the chain. I love folk culture, so I'm enjoying this way too much. But that element in American religious life starts here, and it's never gone away. And it has permeated how the average American, even if that person is in a mainstream, I would say that even in some cases, even if they're in a liturgical church, that ethos, that mindset has permeated the American mind in a lot of ways. And so it also goes to what I call the anti-establishment impulse in the American religious life. When I was an undergrad doing history, I took a course on the history of the Carolinas, and mentioned that in the 1700s, there was such an anti-colonial, anti-establishment ethic that Baptists would actually conspire to have one of their members join the established church just to get on the vestry and cause havoc. Because it wasn't even a religious thing, it was a matter of, it was part of that revolutionary ethos. Church is the man. We're against the man. Apparently there was also a thriving trade in stealing horses of circuit riders. So, so also, as the bishop mentioned, I come to this from kind of a weird personal place. I grew up not just regular Seventh-day Adventists. I always tell people there are Seventh-day Adventists that are basically Nazarenes a day early. Okay? They're Nazarenes who have the weekend. And they're incredibly normal. They're quite harmless. Then there are the other Adventists. The real, to borrow a line again from Hunter S. Thompson, the real hard rockers, man. I grew up around the real hard rockers. My dad was interim pastor of our local Adventist church when I was a kid. I was telling Bishop, I had a great uncle who was a somewhat prominent evangelist among Adventists and also just among like ultra-fundamentalist, apocalyptic circles. He used to write all these books proving that the Pope was the Antichrist and everyone else he disagreed with was the Antichrist and all that. I've met Branch Davidians, that kind of thing. And so I grew up in a cultural place where the book of Revelation was, first of all, was a daily event. I should point that out. And second of all, it was a source of both anxiety and fear, but also it was framed as bad things are going to happen, and here's the escape hatch. And when you start viewing Revelation that way, I think one of the things that I would say to tie up all the things I just said is that when you have all of those threads coming together, what happens is Revelation becomes unmoored from history and also becomes unmoored from church history. And so we can wind up having here, or what I'm going to call the effects of popular eschatology. You have all these narratives. You have the JWs, the SCAs, the LDS, the rest of the alphabet soup. And then also you have below that you have your Tim LaHaye's, you have your Hal Lindsey's, you have your Jack Van Imps, and there are all these competing narratives about the Book of Revelation. I think it's reasonable to suggest that the average person on the street and parenthetically the average Christian is not equipped and frankly not that interested in dividing ice from snow. Is not really that concerned with, well, are you pre-trib, mid-trib, no-trib, dispensation, no. What happens in there is that it all sort of blurs together, and I'm saying this, I'm going to put on my my educational psychology hat for a minute. What happens when you have too much information? Do you weigh all of it equally? My wife grew up Baptist, so here's a phrase that she will ask me when she sees me writing sermons. What's the take-home message? So is it more likely that people are getting they're drinking through the fire hose, they're seeing everything from late-night TV preachers to Iron Maiden albums, they're absorbing all this Revelation. Are they discriminating all this information, or are they just supposed to take home message? Which is more likely? Take home message. Unfortunately, here I'm going to submit to you that this is the message I think they're getting. The world's going to end. We can game this crisis by applying the Book of Revelation, and we can thus manage risk and mitigate externalities by our own hand. That's what all the ammunition's for. That's what all the seeds are for. By the way, has anybody seen Jim Baker recently? Wow! It's wild, man. So, there's also another aspect of this. So there's these two primary, there's one other primary cause. There's really two primary fallacies of popular eschatology. First of all, is risk management. All that stuff we've talked about in all these letters, you can get through it under your own steam as long as you know how to read the text properly, do the right things, and avoid doing the wrong things, and you've got enough canned goods buried, or some variation of that. Because that leads us to the second thing here. The other theme that I see over and over and over again is avoiding the so-called mark of the beast as a substitute for real faith and real obedience. And we've all, there are so many examples. I'm going to just pick a couple here. The one I've seen recently, and I actually saw this from it was a good guy, and I'm sure he was being facetious, but I was a little bit shocked to see it. Not in this guy, the guy looking crazy some other guys. Posted on social media the question of whether taking the COVID vaccine was the mark of the beast. What? I grew up in a tradition where attending church on Sunday was the mark of the beast. My dad's been passed a long time, but he said to me once, he said, well, I know you're going to this church on Sunday and it seems to be keeping you out of trouble, so I'm going to, but someday you're going to make a choice. So that was the culture in my home. That whatever the mark of the beast was, you find that thing, you don't do that thing, you're in like Flint. And what I would say, so even though I grew up in a very extreme version of that, what I have discovered both in talking to people and in kind of looking at the sociological research and so forth, is that that trajectory is actually really common throughout Christian culture. Well, I may be this kind of sinner or that kind of sinner. At least I don't take that mark of the beast. I'm going to be okay. Is that what Revelation teaches us? But it's something we are going to have to confront. And that leads us to a larger problem. I mentioned earlier, I'm insisting on using the phrase popular eschatology because I don't want to step on individuals' toes, because I really think most people are goodwill and so forth. But as clergy who have to do apologetics and have to confront this, so I'm going to throw out just a little piece of social science for you. When we use the terms religion and superstition in a lot of senses, what we usually refer to is conventional religions versus folk religions. But in the study of how religions function sociologically, there's actually another definition that we can use and find useful. And it's the difference between metaphysics as transcendence and metaphysics for acquisition. Okay? It's the idea that when it's the difference between wanting to be saved and wanting to win the lottery. It's the difference between submitting to the will of God and saying, Lord, you'll just help me get an A on this test. I won't steal candy at the grocery store ever again. Those are not the same impulses. And what I would submit to you is that at a very root level, most of the ways in which our culture engages with revelation are fundamentally superstitious. And it's tough. It's tough to say that, and it's tough to say that to people because it sounds really confrontational. But I would submit that once you understand that, you can get to the heart of what's really aching inside of people, what's really hurting them, what they're really afraid of, what they're really missing. And so in this classical model, as Joshua talked about, the way the liturgy is in the form of revelation. Revelation is describing the liturgy. The church provides us guidance on how we apprehend Scripture. You notice that none of that was happening in that historical trajectory I described earlier. In the popular model, eschatology is ultimately, the individual is ultimately the standard of what is true and the agent of change. You're going to read Revelation for yourself. You're going to decide what it means. You're going to act accordingly to avoid the worst possible outcomes thereof. Now, who's at the center of that historiography, that false historiography of Revelation? Who's at the center of that story? Anybody? Who? I am. Me. Saving my own skin. Christ is at the center of that story. So once you understand that, and once you accept that's where people are coming from, we can kind of look at what's going to happen next. And what I would borrow, I hate to borrow a line from Jordan Peterson, but I'm going to. We have the antidote to the chaos. We are the thing that binds their wounds, the thing that makes them not afraid of the future. And this is, if I had one deep thought to share with you as a sentence, being aware of the end of the world without the creed, word, and sacrament produces an unbearable anxiety. You don't get on doomsday preppers if you have the Catholic faith. Have you ever noticed that? Incidentally, I actually, just how far out in the woods I live, I actually have known people who have been on doomsday preppers. It was a very, very weird trip for me. I don't really watch TV, but I was at a client's house one night, and I just kind of walked past the TV, and I went, Bob? And it turns out it's a guy who lives in Asheville, or he actually has a business in Asheville, and he's a very, very that the world is running around looking for all kinds of things, but specifically when they engage revelation. So the narrative arc that Father Gillian referred to, the narrative arc we encounter in the liturgy, and that is articulated in the sacraments, provides a counter-narrative to the popular eschatology. Okay? All the stuff that people are getting about the book of Revelation that's either wrong or is making them afraid or is hardening their hearts or is pointing in the wrong direction, all of that is countered in the book of Revelation. I'm sorry, it isn't in the word of the sacrament. We know how the story ends. We know where we are in the story. And we are sent out into the world with courage and joy, not in fear and anxiety. And as someone who came from an apocalyptic Adventist type background, first of all, I can't tell you how psychologically powerful that idea of, I know how the world's going to end, and I've figured out a workaround, or I've figured out how to game it, or I've figured out how to navigate it. I really can't describe how psychologically powerful that is. But I will note that you don't have to go very far, especially in rural America. You don't have to go very far driving around without finding a church or a storefront or a tent revival has a sign outside. This weekend we're going to tell you about Revelation. We're going to tell you how it's going to end and how you can walk away unscathed. That's not what the Word of the Sacraments calls us. They call us to die to the Christ they live in us. That's a fundamentally different arrangement. And so so what I would offer to you is that when we look at all this stuff, be of good cheer. Know that we are equipped to not only just answer people's questions about the book, about the text, answer people's questions about theology. We are equipped with the antidote to the chaos. And that's really what I came here to say. We are equipped with the antidote to the chaos. And with that, I'm going to leave you right on time for lunch. I'll entertain questions, but I would be interested in hearing your story about the book of Revelation and how you encountered it. I would be interested in hearing if any of what I said resonates with maybe your upbringing, your early life. If I've been told a story about being told to read just that one passage and it was all going to be cool, I can't even begin to describe how that resonated with me. That was a weekly event at my house.